Bueno, en primer lugar, daros la bienvenida a la sesión de hoy. Yo creo que va a ser una sesión muy interesante. Vamos a contar con la presentación por parte de la comisión de dos informes que han realizado este año. El primero es el informe de rendimiento de ciencia, investigación e innovación, el SRIP, y el segundo es el cuadro europeo de indicadores de innovación, el European Innovation Scoreboard. Ambos documentos son importantes, son interesantes. Es muy importante que la comisión esté aquí presentándonos estos documentos. Así es que no quiero yo dilatarme mucho en explicación. Podríamos estar hablando tanto del SRIP como del EIS largo y tendido, porque son dos documentos que conocemos bien. Pero creo que lo mejor es que demos el turno de palabra a la comisión, a quien agradezco su participación, su disponibilidad para estar aquí hoy con nosotros. Así es que adelante, Ignacio y todo el equipo, a Julien, a Valentina y a Tiago. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y os cedo la palabra.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. ¿Me escucháis?
Sí, perfectamente, Ignacio.
Perfecto. No sé si veis la pantalla.
Sí, lo único que si lo puedes dar para ver
Gracias,
a qué
no.
se la
Vale,
completa.
perfecto. Vale, a ver un momento. Ya está. ¿Ahora?
Sí, ahora, perfecto.
Vale, perfecto. Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias al Ministerio por la organización de este evento. También muchísimas gracias a la red de políticas I+D+I por organizar este encuentro. Ya somos sospechosos habituales porque también estuvimos el año pasado presentando el European Innovation Scoreboard y el Regional Innovation Scoreboard. Y luego muchísimas gracias también a todos los asistentes por tomaros el tiempo esta mañana de asistir a esta pequeña charla y escuchar un poquito y compartir el tiempo con nosotros. Me llamo Ignacio Baleztena, yo soy el responsable de las actividades de comunicación y divulgación de mi unidad. Somos la unidad del Chief Economist de la Dirección General de I+D+I. Y antes de comenzar en los estudios, antes de comenzar con ambos informes, me gustaría presentaros qué es lo que hacemos en nuestra unidad. Como yo siempre digo, de alguna manera somos el think tank de la Dirección General de I+D+I. Nuestra responsabilidad principal es diseñar una nueva estrategia de I+D+I para Europa, basada sobre todo en la sostenibilidad medioambiental, en la sostenibilidad social y en la sostenibilidad económica. Combinamos una serie de estudios económicos y de perspectiva, el foresight, y además diseñamos y utilizamos ampliamente una serie de indicadores que acompañan a esos estudios. Hoy vamos a conocer el SRIP y el European Innovation Scoreboard, que de alguna manera son nuestros estudios estrella, no solo de nuestra unidad, sino también de la Dirección General. Sin embargo, en nuestra unidad, trabajamos en una serie de producimos y trabajamos en otros ámbitos también siempre relacionados con este análisis, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, tenemos una relación muy estrecha con la OECD, donde cooperamos en varios ámbitos, por ejemplo, analizando temas de productividad, temas también de financiación del I+D, sobre todo los incentivos fiscales, los análisis de los ecosistemas de innovación. Realizamos también trabajos en modelos macroeconómicos. También tenemos los R&I Paper Series, que son una serie de informes centrados pues, en unos diferentes desafíos en las políticas de I+D+I. Por ejemplo, uno de nuestros últimos informes está relacionado con el impacto que tenía la guerra de Ucrania en las políticas de I+D+I. También trabajamos en la experimentación en las políticas de I+D+I. Llevamos muchos años trabajando también en foresight, en perspectiva, en lo que es perspectiva, y creo que últimamente, y dadas la cadena de crisis que hemos estado viviendo tanto con la pandemia y Ucrania, es uno de los ámbitos en los que estamos trabajando más y esperamos reforzar nuestros esfuerzos en este ámbito. Y luego, por último, también gestionamos un grupo de expertos, que es el grupo ESIR, y que, básicamente lo que hacen es pues hablar del papel transformador de las políticas de I+D+I. Como he comentado, hoy nos vamos a centrar sobre todo en el SRIP y en el European Innovation Scoreboard. Para daros una breve introducción a ambos informes, el SRIP, Science Research and Innovation Performance of the EU, analiza cuáles son las dinámicas de I+D+I y los factores que las impulsan. El informe combina un análisis basado en indicadores y luego también analiza las tendencias actuales socioeconómicas y su impacto que estas tendencias tienen en las políticas de I+D+I. Así, en este caso, el SRIP 2022 proporciona información sobre cómo las políticas de I+D+I pueden ayudar a construir una Europa más inclusiva, más sostenible y competitiva y, sobre todo, resistente en el contexto actual de pospandemia y de guerra en Ucrania. El SRIP analiza ese papel esencial de investigación y cómo la innovación son fuentes de prosperidad y catalizadores del cambio. Para el SRIP pues lo van a presentar mis compañeros Julián, que lidera el equipo de análisis económicos de la unidad y que es coordinador del informe, y luego también mi compañera Valentina, que se encarga también es coautora del SRIP y también es parte de ese equipo de análisis económicos. Y luego el European Innovation Scoreboard, que como ha dicho Cristina, es ese cuadro europeo de indicadores de innovación, en su nombre en español, ofrece un análisis comparativo sobre el rendimiento de la innovación en los Estados miembros, en países vecinos de la Unión Europea y luego con otras potencias mundiales en el ámbito de la innovación. Además, permite a los países analizar cuáles son sus fortalezas y debilidades en sus sistemas nacionales de I+D+I. Y a pesar de que no ofrece recomendaciones, sí que permite a esos países identificar cuáles son las áreas de mejora en sus sistemas nacionales de I+D+I. Yo del European Innovation Scoreboard siempre digo que es una foto fija que habla sobre el rendimiento o que mide el rendimiento de innovación en un país en concreto en un momento concreto utilizando una serie de indicadores. Es quizás un análisis más cuantitativo y el SRIP quizás puede ser un análisis más cualitativo. El European Innovation Scoreboard lo va a presentar mi compañero Tiago, que es uno de los coordinadores del European Innovation Scoreboard. Y sin perder más tiempo, doy paso a mis compañeros Julián y Valentina, que os van a hablar del SRIP.
So good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be there with you this morning. And Valentina and I, we will try to give you an overview of the report, the SRIP report, which is a quite challenging task because it's a quite big report, almost 800 pages. But we will try to do our best. So as Ignacio just said, if my Spanish is not too bad. In this report, we look at how research and innovation, or R&I and R&I policies, how these can help us to build a Europe that is inclusive, sustainable, competitive, and resilient. The last edition was released early 2020. And when we published it, actually, COVID happened. And I must say that since the 2020 edition, a lot of new developments happened. So COVID, and more recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is on top of long-run challenges for which R&I is critical, such as climate change. So we needed in this edition to make sure that all these developments were reflected in our thinking. And overall, this crisis, the changing environment and the uncertainty of current and future times are underpinning the narrative of this edition. So we wanted to stress that in the title of our report, which is then Building a Sustainable Future in Uncertain Times. The report covers a wide range of dimensions, which we believe are relevant for R&I policy today, but we try to be comprehensive. And some readers may be more interested in some chapters, in particular, depending on the sector, the field, the type of organization. So we believe that there is something interesting for everyone in this report. Hopefully, everything is interesting for everyone. But we created it in a way that you can directly jump into a chapter to really have a focus, for example, on universities, on technology, on regional analysis, etc. We drafted it with Commission colleagues, mainly, so 70% was drafted by the Commission. This is part one of the report. And in part 2, we drafted the chapters with academic authors. Also, the European Investment Bank drafted a chapter. We also collaborated with the OECD for another chapter. So we really tried to co-create this report with also external stakeholders. So here on this slide, you can see that overall we tried to reduce all these analytical insights into 6 messages. You can see that the first 3 on the top of the figure illustrate the idea that EU research and innovation policy today and in the future will be at the center of a triangle of transformation, competitiveness, and resilience. So this is what these top 3 messages illustrate. And at the bottom, what we try to summarize is how we can make the best of our RNI in the EU based on recent trends and literature. If you look at the executive summary, you will see that we really tried to structure this summary into these 6 messages acting as a hub to make connections to the various chapters in the report. So we really say, okay, if you're interested in message 2, you can go to these chapters, etc. Now, let's move to the first message. There we are arguing that research and innovation can help us to build forward better in the post-pandemic world. So this expression of building forward better, we borrowed it from our high-level group of experts, ESIR, which Ignacio mentioned just before. This group is advising the European Commission, and this formulation stresses that in the future we have to do things differently. And in a post-pandemic recovery, which is a very important dimension of the report, we believe there is a new momentum to transform our economies and address the huge issue of climate change. And actually, global challenges and sustainable development are cross-cutting in this edition of the report. For example, here on this slide, you can see that we provide some figures on the patent production of the EU in relation to different global challenges. And we show some strength of the European Union in some areas, including climate, transport, energy. Now, another interesting aspect is that all this is clearly dominated by the huge rise of China. And this rise is at the expense of the EU, but also, and sometimes even more, at the expense of the US. We also provide specific insights in some areas. For example, here, we highlight that there is a declining trend in clean and efficient energy patenting, and this happened in the first half of the 2010s. And in the report, we try to understand what happened, and we provide some analysis on the reasons behind. Our major instrument at the European level to invest in research and innovation is the EU RNI Framework Program. And today it is Horizon Europe, and we are interested in understanding a bit better everything surrounding the report. And for example, we show how 12% of the research supporting the very visible and impactful IPCC reports have been partially or fully funded by EU programs. Now, as a second message, we also believe that RNI can be a key component to help Europe to gain or regain competitiveness, in particular in current times, which are characterized also by the challenge of digitalizing the economy. And digitalization is also an important horizontal aspect of the report, including its acceleration with COVID. One very important element to boost competitiveness is productivity, and we have a focus on this in the report because it relates directly to technological progress. We show, for example, here on this graph that labor productivity in Europe is driven by a number of factors such as R&D, physical capital, but also most notably human capital. Here for a selection of countries that is based on data availability. And human capital is also an important dimension of the report as we relate education, skills, and researchers to research and innovation. It is very important to RNI, and we do it in a lot of chapters in the report. In order to stimulate competitiveness and innovation, we also need a dynamic business landscape. So in the report, we also look at this. We look at the situation of startups and scale-ups in Europe, and these play a very important role in fostering innovation and potentially disruptive innovation. For example, on this graph, we can see that we have less startup. No, on this graph, actually, we are doing quite well in terms of emerging startup ecosystems. But we still have less startup ecosystems than in Asia or the US. We also have an issue of scale-ups and availability of capital for firms to do scale-ups. So this will be also covered to some extent by my colleague Valentina. As a third message, we say that we need to think the unthinkable and be ready for it. So this relates directly to the idea that with recent crises and developments, the instability of the world has taken a much more prominent space in all this discussion about research and innovation. And research and innovation plays a crucial role in this. So we say think the unthinkable because we want to highlight that we have been shaken by recent events, in particular COVID-19 and the geopolitical evolution. And research and innovation plays a role in this. I mentioned the huge rise of China. Now, the globalization of value chains in this context has been a source of productivity gains, but it has also created vulnerabilities, including in the RNA domain. And this raises questions in terms of reinforcing resilience and strengthening the EU's technological sovereignty, so that there is a change in all the global powers. But we also had the Russian invasion that has exposed the vulnerabilities of the EU energy sector. And this calls even more for efforts to accelerate the development and deployment of energy efficient and clean energy technologies. If we do that, we can hope to reduce our dependence while at the same time contributing to the implementation of the European Green Deal. Now, the EU is not too badly positioned when it comes to green technologies. We saw that for the first message. But when looking at digital fields, such as artificial intelligence, the picture is quite different. And there we could expect the EU sovereignty to be more at risk. Now, more generally, when it comes to crisis, when it comes to thinking the unthinkable, we like to refer to what we call the zoology of crisis. New crises will come in the future, and these can take different shapes. We can have black swans, which are rare events with very big impacts and which are very difficult or impossible to predict. We can also have gray rhinos, and these are crises for which we have some signals beforehand. And if we don't act, the rhinos start charging at us for huge impact. Now, what can we do? We can build flexibility in the system, and we can increase responsiveness, even if we cannot anticipate black swans. And for gray rhinos, we can prepare ourselves. We can prepare based on the warnings, in particular from the scientific community. We can equip ourselves with the right tools. And this really highlights, in our view, the importance of foresight, which also Ignacio mentioned, long-run risk assessments, and overall, it strongly supports the integration of knowledge into policies. You should speak here. The camera.
So
okay, but I don't know if this is.
it's okay. Okay, thank you, Julian, and good morning, everyone. So now we move to the second block of messages of the report, and we look at how we can make the best out of R&I. And here, first obvious channel relates to investing and valorization. If we want to leverage on business, institutions, and people, we need to focus on investment, but we also need to be able to valorize these investments. And when we look, for instance, at R&D investments, the data shows that there has been some improvements in the EU performance over time, although despite our efforts and our commitment, our performance is still significantly lower than that of other competitors. And in particular, if you look at the graph on the left, the trend that is particularly striking is the significant increase in R&D spending made by China. At the same time, if we look at R&D intensity, meaning R&D investment over GDP, our performance also in this case still positions us quite far from our 3% target. And what is interesting is that if we take the 3% target as a benchmark, we will need to inject about 1 billion euro per year in order to achieve it. And we also observe that this annual investment gap is quite persistent over time. And this for us is quite interesting result and quite symbolic, because the amount that we're talking about, 100 billion euro, corresponds to the overall budget for our framework program Horizon Europe over 6 years. Now, producing knowledge and innovation per se, obviously it's not enough. One major issue that we have been stressing a lot over time is that Europe still seems struggling in reap the full benefit out of its scientific performance. And this, of course, has implications both in terms of innovation and economic growth. So if we, stay back. So, and if we are good in terms of producing scientific results, unfortunately, we're not as good when it comes to translate these results into a marketable solution. And this is reflected by several indicators, such as, for instance, the share of high-tech expert publication, high-quality publications and patent, as you can see from the slide, when we compare us to United States and China. So overall, the message that we put forward here is that we need to increase our efforts in order to bridge the gap between basic research, between research results and the market. And so we need to promote a culture of knowledge valorization in order to foster our NI system and allow them to catch up and with other major economies and to become and thus becoming more competitive on international scene. And this can be done in several ways, such as, for instance, assuring that knowledge-based institutions manage their intellectual capital correctly, but also promoting and further strengthening the relationship between businesses, academia, citizens, and policymakers. Another important aspect that we highlight in the report concerns the need to connect actors and address disparities. And the overall idea is that the persistence of disparities in opportunities in a regional level raise some concerns in terms of the efficiency, but also the fairness of innovation development. And this, of course, poses some challenges, especially if our aim is to untap the full potential of our RNI system. And for instance, here in the slide on the screen, we show you what is the situation at EU regional level when we look at R&D intensity. In the report, we also tackle the innovation divide, so the differences in the regional performance at EU level using other type of indicators. And overall, the data points towards a clear lack of convergence. So what we observe is that the best performing regions keep improving their performance, increasing the gap with least performing ones. And although in some cases, of course, we notice some catch up, the overall trend is that the gap is still there, and to some extent it appears to be widening. And another important aspect that it's related to this innovation divide concerns the degree of cooperation that we have in the EU. Here on the slide, we show you the inter- and intra-regional collaboration in patent activities over time. And the striking element is that over 70% of co-patenting activities in Europe happens within the same regions, the same region, and only a smaller smaller percentages, a smaller share, occur instead between regions within the same member states. And even a much smaller, significantly much smaller portion instead takes place between regions across different EU countries. And this is a major element that we want to emphasize and we need to tackle, because it is in strike contrast to the performance of other economies. If we think, for instance, at the US, in there we notice that collaborations between researchers take place based on a competitive advantage and knowledge specialization type of consideration, while in the EU it's quite clear that it's the geographical position of the researchers that still plays a prominent role. And of course, if for both knowledge diffusion and technological innovation, the collaboration, and more in general the circulation of idea is of critical importance if we want to tackle major societal challenges, as it would ensure that any technological development is fully able to benefit and to leverage on existing knowledge and the work already done. So here the message is that it is essential for us to strengthen the ties between the regions, going also beyond the national borders, and this of course need to be done also through R&I policies at European level. Final point concerns instead the need to guarantee that we have the right enabling condition at play for R&I. And on one hand, this of course requires having the right regulation in place. Now, as you can see here from the plot, better regulatory quality is typically corresponds to a better innovation performance. Now, of course, once someone wants to investigate the relationship between regulatory quality and innovation performance, there are several challenges and several aspects that need to be taken into account, such as, for instance, the pace of innovation. Furthermore, when we look at EU specifically, of course, we also need to account for EU-specific challenges like the the length of the legislative process, as well as the different implementation process that we may find at a national level. However, the message here is that regulation anyway represent a powerful instruments to foster innovation in the EU. And this is also the reason why facilitating innovation through an improved regulatory framework is one of the key flagship of the new innovation agenda published in July, which, among other things, highlights the importance of experimentation approaches such as regulatory sandboxes in order to develop a flexible and R&I friendly regulatory framework that must be able to quickly adapt to a fast changing environment. However, regulation per se, of course, is not the only element we need to take into account when we talk about enabling R&I. Another important aspect that we cover in the report concerns the availability of financing resources. At the beginning of the presentation, we already mentioned the existing gap between the EU and the US in terms of innovative startups and scale-ups. A similar gap exist also when we look at unicorn firms, meaning fast-growing companies with a market capitalization equal or above $1 billion. And the similar and significant gap also exists between the two economies when we look at venture capital funding. And in particular, what we observe is that the EU reports about 7 times less venture capital funding than the US. Now, this is, of course, an important challenge that we need to tackle. Ensuring access to finance is crucial in order for innovation to thrive. And the EU is engaging in several initiatives in this sense in order to improve access to capital markets, such as, for instance, through further development of the capital union, but also adopting other type of initiatives that may be more tailored to specific economic segments. Let me then conclude here by providing you again with the overview of the 6 main overarching messages of the report. Obviously, the report includes, like Julian said at the beginning, a wide range of additional information and data that fall under each and every one dimension that we've been presenting today. And of course, you can access it freely online and get access also to all the other data that we included that. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias, Valentina, Julián. Ignacio.
Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias también a vosotros y quedamos a la espera de si hay alguna pregunta por parte de los asistentes, si pudiese ser en inglés, y si no, no os preocupéis porque la traduciremos, la traduciré yo aquí a mis compañeros.
Muy bien.
Well, if nobody has a question, may I pose a question? Just from the Secretariat. Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So, Valentina, you mentioned regulation and financing as the main barriers to those sites to reach the market. What do you think is in the case of Spain, what do you think is the main barrier, financing or regulation?
So thank you for the question. Now, in the report, we don't cover the specific situation of the single member states. However, more in general, so let me provide you a more general answer to that. What we notice is that, of course, a combination of the two aspects, because one of the reasons why we, as a Europe, we may be less attractive in terms of venture capital, if we want to take, so less attractive for investment. Of course, this is also related to the administrative burdens that are also related to the length of the legislation that we observe across member states. And is also the heterogeneity in our regulatory framework across different countries and regions that constitute an additional barriers, because it makes more complicated for the investors to identify where the best investment opportunity may be, and of course that can discourage them. Obviously, this is just one side. Whenever we talk about these big challenges, there are a lot of elements that play a role at the same time. But in order to answer your question, I would say there is a combination between the two.
Thank you.
Sí, y luego en el European Innovation Scoreboard presentaremos una foto de la situación de España a nivel más específico. Si tienes alguna otra pregunta.
Por el chat, de momento no ha llegado nada y nadie ha levantado la mano. Así que si queréis seguimos con el EIS.
De todas formas, en el caso de que luego haya preguntas también al final, sobre el SRIP o sobre el European Innovation Scoreboard, podemos hacer las preguntas y las respuestas.
Muchas gracias.
Pues, como decís, si os parece bien, continuamos con el European Innovation Scoreboard, con el cuadro europeo de indicadores de innovación, y mi compañero Tiago, que es uno de los coordinadores de la publicación, os va a hacer la presentación.
Tiago, no te escuchamos.
¿Y ahora?
Sí, ahora, perfecto.
Okay. Buenos días y muchas gracias por la invitación. Creo que nos hemos ya visto el año pasado, pero voy a hacer en inglés, es más fácil para mí. And And just to say that I think it's actually very good that we have these two presentations on the same day, because even though the European Innovation Scoreboard, as my colleague Ignacio said, it has like a snapshot of the main weaknesses and strengths based on the indicators of every member state, and in this case also for Spain. But I mean, there is a clear link also with the SRIP report. I mean, the messages there are also linked to the results that the European Innovation Scoreboard tell us. And even though the scoreboard is also more target in terms of indicators, I mean, in the SRIP you find much more data and indicators. And I have to say that I was also one of the co-authors of the report, and I prepare most of the graphs and the data. And I mean, Spain is in many of the indicators. So not for all indicators, but you can find the countries, and you can see also make the comparisons and look at the performance of the countries in the SRIP. So as I said, I will present the key results of this year's edition of the European Innovation Scoreboard. My colleague Ignacio already mentioned that, so the purpose of the EIS is to make a comparative assessment of the research innovation performance, and indeed it gives a kind of a picture of the weaknesses and strengths of each country based on the data. So just to have a brief overview of the measurement framework. So there is no changes this year. So we keep the same framework as last year. So we have the four main groups, the 12 innovation dimensions and 32 indicators. So there is no changes in comparison to last year, because last year we actually had a report, and I think this was also mentioned in the last year's presentation that we had with you as well. And of course, all this information is available in the methodology report that is available in the website. So in terms of methodology, just very briefly, so we collect the data, we do some imputation where data is missing, we treat for the outliers and the skewness of the indicators, and then we we do a normalization of the 32 indicators using this formula, and the idea is to have the score between 0 and 1. Then we make the sum of all indicators and divide by the 32. So we make the average of the 32 indicators, and then we have the score for each country. And then the performance, how is it presented in the report, is relative to the EU. So we make the index of the EU relative to the EU in 2015 or 2022, and then we have the score for each country. So this is the results for this year. So we see that we kept also the four performance groups. These also didn't change. This performance is measured as relative to the EU average. So we have in 2022, so we have 2 performance groups above the EU average and 2 performance groups below. So we have the innovation leaders and the strong innovators above, and then the moderate innovators and emerging innovators below. And we actually see a clear innovation divide in the European Union. So we see that most of the countries with the lower performance are located in the South and Eastern Europe, while the countries with the best performance are located in the North and, let's say, Western Central Europe. Here we have the ranking. So you can see that Sweden is the top performers in the EU. We see that, for example, Spain is actually located quite in the middle of the ranking between Portugal and Italy. So I think we feel right at home in the south. And here, just to also explain a bit the graph, so the color columns correspond to the performance of each member state in 2022 relative to the EU in 2015. Then we have these dark columns, which correspond to the performance of each member state in 2015 relative to the EU in 2015. And then we have these small lines on top, which are the performance of each member state in 2021 relative to the EU in 2015. And so we can see that for most of the countries, performance improved between 2015 and 2021 and 2022, which we will see actually in the next slide as well. And we also see that for about, I think, 18 member states, performance also improved in comparison to the previous year. So here we see the performance change over time as long term. So between 2015 and 2022, we see that actually Cyprus is the best performance country, and we quite a big difference in comparison to the second and the third and so on member states. With the performance change almost 40 percentage points increase. And then we see that also Estonia, Greece, Lithuania, Czech Republic, and also Finland also improved quite a lot in this time frame. We see that among all the member states, only France actually declined with a very small decline, and Romania remained quite stable. We don't see a clear, let's say, convergence between the member states, but we see a bit of convergence within the group. So we see, for example, that the moderate innovators are actually improving quite well. I mean, most of them are on the top in terms of performance, but we also see that member states that are already as the top performance, like Belgium and Finland, for instance, they still manage to improve a lot over time. So there is, so we see that there is a quite variety of performances in the member states. Another interesting feature of this year's edition is that when we look at the top performance in every of the 12 dimensions, we see a quite variety of member states, and actually only Sweden managed to be the top in 2 dimensions, so in employment, impacts, and human resources. But in all the other dimensions, we have a different country. So this shows that even though the countries are not the top performers in all dimensions, they can still excel in one specific dimension. And we see even countries with lower performance, like, for example, Greece, they still manage to be the top in the dimension of innovators. But most of the countries are actually strong innovators or innovation leaders. If we look at the EU performance as a whole, here we see that we see the performance of the EU for all the 12 dimensions and relative to the EU also in 2015. So we see if the bars are to the right, it means that the performance improved. So we see, because the EU in 15 is like 100, so if it is above 100, it means it improved over time. If it is below it, it means that it declined over time. And we see that actually between 2015 and 2022, the EU only declined in the intellectual assets, which includes, for example, patent applications, which was also something that we saw in the SRIP as well, and also in human resources. But for all of the other dimensions, the EU actually managed to improve. And we also see that it also managed to improve in comparison to the last year, which is this the black column. For example, in finance and support, the EU managed also to improve in comparison to last year. But we see that for long term, the EU actually improved a lot in linkages, for example, in the innovators, which is the share of innovative companies, in product innovation and in business innovators, and also in finance and support. So I think this is also, it shows a clear link to the SRIP. So we see that the EU is still not yet there in terms of investments, but it's slowly progressing over time. The report, as you know, it also includes some neighbor countries of the European Union, and we have here the full list. We see that most of the countries are actually located as emerging innovators, and those are mostly the Balkan and countries that are located in the South and Eastern Europe. We see that Switzerland is the innovation leader, and actually a novelty of this year is that we included for the first time Albania also in the list of countries. And here we have the ranking again. So we see that Switzerland is really the top performance among all European countries. And we see that most of most of the countries located in Balkan countries are actually in the emerging innovators on the bottom of the table. We also have the comparison with the international countries, the international benchmarking. Also, novelty of this year's edition is that the EU, for the first time, overtook Japan, and with quite a big difference. So it means that the EU is actually improving over time. And even though it lags behind Australia, United States, Canada, and South Korea, it actually managed to improve more than these countries between 2015 and 2022. This information is not available in the slide, but we saw that only China managed to improve more than the EU within this time frame. So this also means that China is catching up quickly, but it also means that the EU is actually improving quite well. And but just to mention that also the list of indicators is it's smaller, so because we don't have all the information for all the international countries. I would like also just to raise a small note on the comparison across editions. So as you know, many people tend to compare editions. We always advise not to do it, and this is because every time we have a new edition, we back calculate the data. And this means that some of the indicators might have changed, or data might have become also available in that specific year. So as you know, the year does not correspond exactly to the year of the data. So when we say that the current year 2022 does not mean that all the indicators are available for 2022. It means that, for example, some indicators have data for 2021, other indicators 2020, or other indicators 2019. And of course, then we impute the data for the most current years, and these to give us the current performance. But this means that when we have a new edition, and we back calculate, the data might have become available, and then the years might have changed. The performance of those specific years might have changed. So, and this is just an example of why we shouldn't compare editions over time. And another impact might be it's related to the normalization process. And here, for example, we give an example. Even if the value is kept the same, so without any change, we see that if the maximum and the minimum change, because when we have new data, we might have a different maximum and minimum for the countries. We see that with different maximum minimum scores, the normalization score will also be different. And of course, this will have an impact in the results of the current edition in comparison to the previous editions of the report. And now I will move to the performance of Spain in the EIS 2022. Also, a novelty of this year is that we have a country profile with 2 pages. So as we know, in the previous years, we only had 1 page, which was featuring in the main report, but also in these standalone documents that you can find in the website. Where the first page is located, you can find it in the main report, and this 2-page profile, you can find it in these standalone documents in the website. And so on the first page, you can find the location of the country in the ranking, and you can compare it also with the average of the group. So in this case, for Spain, is the moderate innovators, and we see that Spain it's slightly below the average of the moderate innovators. You can also find the performance change over time and compare it with the EU, so you can see if the country is improving better or worse than the EU in terms of change over time. And then you can also find the performance change for all the indicators, and you can find the weakness and the relative strengths and the relative weaknesses. And then on the second page, you can find the performance of the country relative to the country itself. So here, I think this is an important feature because you don't take into account the performance change of the EU. So if you want to know how is the country actually performing to itself, you can find here. You can find it here in this second page, and you see that, for example, Spain has actually improved quite strongly, especially in 2021 and 2022, with a big increase in terms of the performance. And then you can also find the performance change in all of the dimensions, in all of the 12 dimensions. And then on the side, we have a list of contextual structural indicators. This list was already present in the previous editions as well. Now it's located in this second page in this standalone document. And you see we have indicators related to, for example, the innovation profiles feature, and you can see how Spain compares to the EU in terms of the share of, for example, in-house product innovators with market novelties. or, for example, in the share of non-innovators with potential to innovate. I think this is also an important data which comes from the Community Innovation Survey, which is a survey carried out by Eurostat, also in collaboration, of course, with the national statistical offices. And this also can give an indication of where you should put your efforts in terms of, for example, innovative companies. And so, as I said, so Spain is a moderate innovator with a performance which is almost 89% of the EU average. It performs slightly below of the average of the moderate innovators, and in terms of performance change, it's 8.6 percentage points, which is slightly below the EU performance. So the Spain in this case is moving away from the EU average. In terms of relative strengths and weaknesses, so Spain is quite strong in terms of sales of innovative products, people with above basic overall digital skills, in terms of broadband penetration, population with tertiary education, and lifelong learning. And Spain is performing the worst in terms of government support for business R&D. So here, for example, this I think replies to your question to Valentina, if finance is a problem for Spain. Here, it's an indication that indeed, when we compare it to the EU, Spain performs lower. And this government support to business means direct support, but also tax incentives, which is data that comes from OECD. And also performs, again, also in terms of R&D expenditure in the business sector. It also is one of the relative weaknesses, and other indicators, for instance, employment, innovative enterprises, business process innovators, or innovative SMEs collaborating with others. In terms of performance change over time, so in the long term, Spain improved quite well in terms of public-private co-publications, also in the sales of innovative products, and decline in terms of the environmental-related technologies, again, in the government support for business R&D. So in this case, Spain is not only one of their weaknesses, but also is decreasing over time, and also in terms of enterprises providing ICT training. But and compared to last year, Spain improved quite strongly in broadband penetration, also in knowledge-intensive service exports, but decline in terms of resource productivity, for instance, and again in government support for business and R&D. Here we also show the performance of Spain relative to the EU in 2015 and relative to the EU in the same year. So we see if we keep the EU performance stable over time, we see that actually Spain improved quite well. So it was 89, and now it's in 2022 is actually the best, one of their best performance, 28. But if we also make the EU moving over time, so if the performance of the EU changes over time as well, we see that actually the Spain relative to the EU has not changed. So we see that it keeps also 89. So the relative to the EU, the performance of Spain has not improved in this case. So this was the main performance of Spain, and now just to finalize my presentation. So as you know, our contractor is not only in charge of producing the reports, but has also some extra work. One of the work relates to in this case to gender dimension. So the idea of this exploratory work is to assess how the gender dimension can be included and integrated in the context of the IS and the Regional Innovation Scoreboard, either adding new indicators in the framework or as a contextual indicator. So we had already some work in terms of literature review. We also had an expert workshop, and the note, which was actually supposed to be finished in October, but it's a bit delayed, so it will be published towards the end of December. And another important study that is currently ongoing as well relates to a feasibility study on a possible European startup scoreboard. So as you know, startups, scale-ups, deep tech, it's very important and very high now in the European agenda. We had the new European Innovation Agenda, which was published in July, that calls for more data in these fields. And so we decided to include this small exploratory study. So the idea is to make a mapping of the definitions and definitions and possible data sources that are out there and can measure this type of information, so startups and so on. We actually had now a survey that was sent to the member states on either they have some already or which definitions they used to finance, for example, startups. And then the idea is to have by January, so the beginning of the year, the final report with some information. And of course, we will not at the moment integrate any of this information in the EIS yet. If there is any revision in the future, as you know, we will always do this in collaboration with the member states and with workshops, but it's not planned for now in the current edition. And just to finalize it with, so as you know, also this information is available in the European Innovation Scoreboard interactive tool, where you can find all the European data and also regional data, which is not yet updated. So as you know, the Regional Innovation Scoreboard is published every 2 years. We had it last year, and now we'll have it next year. So in this tool, you cannot find the new data because it's not yet updated. Thank you.
Tiago, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Como ha dicho Tiago, este año el Unión Innovation Scoreboard lo publicamos cada 2 años y este año simplemente hemos publicado el European Innovation Scoreboard, que es una comparación entre países. Si tenéis alguna pregunta.
¿Sí? En el chat de momento nada.
Bueno, yo creo que no hay preguntas. La verdad que es raro porque ha sido una sesión bastante interesante. Tanto el SRIP como para nosotros es más conocido el European. Es una tabla de indicadores con la que venimos trabajando hace tiempo, que conocemos bien y que conocemos muy bien en profundidad. El SRIP era un documento nuevo. Os agradezco mucho la presentación. Me parece que es muy interesante. Me parece además que es muy interesante esa forma de construir un documento para que cada uno pueda ir viendo aquello y profundizando en aquello que le parezca relevante o que tenga una necesidad específica en cada momento. Me parece que esta visión de un documento de esa envergadura es importante. No es un documento, como muy bien habéis dicho, para leer de una tirada, pero sí es un documento para tener encima de la mesa y para poderlo visitar. Visitar cuando haga falta, consultar, analizar. Así es que muchas gracias por los dos, por el trabajo que hacéis, por lo que supone para nosotros, que siempre es muy bienvenido, y muchas gracias por vuestra disponibilidad para estar aquí hoy. No sé si alguien tiene algo más que decir y si no, pues nos despediríamos aquí y nos volveremos a encontrar seguramente. Muchas gracias a la comisión.
Muchísimas gracias también a todos los asistentes por haber tenido el tiempo. Y bueno, hay una pregunta, me parece.
Sí. Hay una pregunta en el chat.
Sí.
Sí,
hay una pregunta regarding
de María José Perza, de Andalucía.
Yeah, so for the moment, we don't, as I said, so we don't plan to include any new indicator in the edition of 2023. Maybe under these structural indicators. So in the contextual indicators, we can always add it one more indicator because it does not affect the overall score. And in this case, we can improve a bit, or we can increase the size of the table in the profile. But for the main conceptual framework, we don't plan to do any revision for next year. So that is not the case.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a...
There is another question, I think, from Francesca. ¿No?
Yes.
the variety.
Well, I don't know if it was for me or for maybe for the work of Valentina in the SRIP. I mean, in terms of regions, we didn't do an update of the Region Innovation Scoreboard, so we don't know if there was conversions in terms of performance for this year. We saw that in the countries, across the countries or between the member states, we saw that there was a small convergence, but it was so small that you cannot really understand it, and I mean you cannot even perceive it. But we saw that within the groups we saw some convergence, and for example, in the moderate innovators, we could see that most of the countries are actually improving quite fast towards the best performing countries. But on the other hand, we had, for example, in the emerging innovators, we had Romania and Bulgaria, for instance, which are the worst performance in the EU, which are actually moving away from the EU. So we cannot really say that there is a convergence across the EU in terms of the member states. In terms of the regions, so as I said, we didn't do any update. And now I don't recall the results of last year, but I think we could also see a small convergence. But again, it includes a lot of data. But then in the SRIP, you can also actually see in more detail in single indicators if there is some conversion. But maybe my colleague.
Yeah. This is a very important topic. Actually, the regional dimension is something. Maybe you can move to the camera because it's further. But the regional dimension is something that we started to investigate a bit more since the 2020 edition, because it's true that we can see that there is some kind of convergence at the national level. But what we also observed is that there are very, very important dynamics that are happening at the regional level. That there is a very high concentration of research and innovation, and the dynamics happen within the country borders. You can look at the more rural versus urban regions. There are a lot of disparities. And actually, does it converge at the regional level? I must say that when you look at the patents, for example, then no, that there is a divergence between the different types of regions within the country. So this really calls for investigating and exploring a bit more at the regional level. Now, if you look at publications, then there is a bit more of a convergence, but even that has been slowing down over the past years. So there are very interesting dynamics. In the SRIP report, there is a whole chapters. There are two whole chapters actually on regional analysis. So you can have a look at it. There are very interesting disparities to analyze at this level.
Os pedimos disculpas porque no sabemos qué pasa con la cámara, que nos ha dejado de seguir en la sala de reuniones. Entonces seguimos aquí. Lo único, no sé por qué ha dejado de funcionar. O sea, que os pedimos disculpas, pero vamos, que seguimos aquí todos. Fue con una silla vacía, pero estamos en la reunión, estamos siguiendo vuestras preguntas y el análisis. Estamos intentando viendo a ver si lo podemos arreglar. Ahora, ya estamos.
Ahora te vemos.
Perfecto, gracias. Si tenéis alguna pregunta más.
En el chat nos dicen que es muy interesante, muchas gracias, y que esperarán una similar para el RIS 2022.
Perfecto. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos.
Otra vez las sillas, Ignacio. Ya.
Sí. Muchísimas gracias a todos los asistentes y también es una vez más al Ministerio y a la red por la organización de este evento, y también agradecer a mis compañeros el que hayan estado aquí. Tendréis las diapositivas a vuestra disposición y si tenéis cualquier tipo de pregunta no dudéis en contactarnos. Y además os vamos a pasar también un pequeño vídeo que quizás a lo mejor Paloma, Beatriz y Adrián podéis incluir con un breve resumen sobre el SRIP y las key findings, ¿no? del informe SRIP 2022.
Perfecto, lo colgaremos todo en la web de eventos para que esté todo junto. Muchísimas gracias.